Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight we drift into the shadows of Ipswich, a town in Suffolk, during the late autumn of 2006. Picture a landscape draped in the damp, heavy air of October. The sky over the River Orwell is often a bruised purple, fading into a deep, impenetrable black as the sun dips below the horizon. The streets here are lined with brick and mortar, ancient and sturdy, but beneath the familiar architecture of this market town, a quiet unease was beginning to take root. We are entering a world of long shadows and yellow-tinted street lamps, where the rhythmic hum of distant traffic is the only sound that breaks the stillness of the night. It is a time when the world was looking elsewhere, unaware of the darkness brewing in the heart of the community. It was the 30th of October, 2006. The night was crisp, the kind of cold that clings to your skin and makes you huddle deeper into your coat. 19-year-old Tania Nichol stepped out into this biting air, leaving her mother's home in the Chantry area. Tania was young, described by those who knew her as caring and sensitive, a girl who had once dreamed of a life far different from the one she was living. She was small in stature, perhaps making her seem even more vulnerable against the industrial backdrop of the Handford Road area. As she walked, her footsteps would have echoed softly against the damp pavement, passing the silhouettes of darkened warehouses and the quiet, looming presence of the football stadium. The orange glow of the street lamps cast long, wavering shapes across the brickwork. When Tania did not return, the silence that followed was heavy. At first, there was no headline, no frantic search by the masses. To the wider world, she was simply a 19-year-old girl who had slipped through the cracks of the evening. But in the quiet rooms of her home, the absence was a physical weight. Her mother, Carrie, believed her daughter was working at a bar or perhaps a hair salon, unaware of the secret world Tania had entered to fund a growing addiction. As days turned into a week, and then two, the mystery of her whereabouts remained contained within the small circle of those who loved her. A single flame of worry flickering in the cold Suffolk wind, waiting for a sign that never came. Then came the 15th of November, 2006. The temperature had dropped further, and a thin veil of mist often clung to the banks of the river. Gemma Adams was 25 years old, a woman with a bright smile and a history that spoke of a comfortable childhood in the village of Kesgrave. She had been a girl who played the piano, a member of the Brownies, and an intelligent student who once worked for a local insurance firm. But on this night, at 1:15 in the morning, she was seen for the last time standing near a BMW dealership on West End Road. She was wearing a black waterproof jacket and light blue jeans. When she failed to reply to text messages from her partner, a different kind of silence began to spread through the town, a chilling realization that something was deeply wrong. The area where these women vanished was a patch of Ipswich that felt isolated from the rest of the town's bustling life. The red light district centered around a few banal streets like Burlington Road, Handford Road, and the edges of London Road. At night, these places were largely deserted, the office blocks standing like empty sentinels over the asphalt. There is a specific texture to this part of the town, the smell of the river, the gritty feel of the industrial yards, and the way the wind whistles through the gaps in the chain-link fences. It was a place where people were often overlooked, where the women plying their trade were thin, shadowed figures moving through the amber light, trying to survive in a world that rarely looked them in the eye. As the search for Tania continued, and the investigation into Gemma's disappearance began, the atmosphere in Ipswich shifted from concern to a growing dread. The quiet disappearance of two young women in such a short span of time started to weave a thread of fear through the community. People began to look twice at the cars cruising slowly through the streets, and the windows of the houses on London Road seemed to watch the pavement with renewed intensity. Somewhere in one of those houses, behind a red front door, a man named Steve Wright was watching, too. The night was still, the air was cold, and the river continued its slow, silent journey toward the sea, carrying secrets that were yet to be revealed to a town that was just beginning to wake up to its own nightmare. December 2nd, 2006, arrived with a bite that only a Suffolk winter can truly possess. The landscape around Hindlesham was muted, a palette of slate grays and dormant browns, with the skeletal silhouettes of trees reaching toward a low, heavy sky. Belstead Brook, a winding artery of water that usually whispers peace to the surrounding meadows, was swollen with the late autumn rains. It moved with a quiet, persistent energy, cutting through the silt and the reeds. On this morning, the air was thick with a damp mist that seemed to swallow sound, leaving only the soft gurgle of the brook as it traveled toward the sea. It was a place where one might expect to find only the traces of nature, like the prints of a deer or the tangled debris of fallen branches. But the stillness was about to be shattered by a discovery that would change the soul of Ipswich forever. Trevor Saunders, a water bailiff at Hindlesham Fisheries, was a man who knew these waters well. His eyes were trained to spot the subtle changes in the flow and the obstructions that might hinder the passage of fish. As he walked along the bank at Thorpe's Hill, he noticed something unusual. 2 mounds were protruding from the surface of the shallow water, caught against the edge. At first, his mind sought a rational, harmless explanation. Perhaps it was a discarded shop mannequin or a large piece of debris thrown into the stream as a cruel prank. He reached out to touch what he thought was a plastic surface, but the reality was immediate and chilling. The surface was not plastic. It was cold, yielding skin. When he saw a small trace of blood near a nostril, the truth became undeniable. This was not a dummy. This was a human being, a woman, left to the mercy of the freezing current. The arrival of the authorities brought a sharp, clinical contrast to the rural quiet of the brook. Within hours, the muddy banks were lined with blue and white police tape, a stark barrier between the world of the living and the silence of the scene. The flashing lights of the patrol cars cast rhythmic, artificial pulses against the damp bark of the trees. Forensic teams, clad in white protective suits that crinkled with every movement, began the delicate task of securing the area. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, aware that every footstep could disturb a vital clue. A large yellow tent was erected over the spot where the woman had been found, creating a temporary, shadowed sanctuary for the investigation. The transition was complete. This was no longer a search for a missing daughter. It was a crime scene of the highest order, and the air felt heavier for it. The body was soon identified as 25-year-old Gemma Adams. Gemma had been missing since the early hours of November 15, 2 weeks of agonizing uncertainty for her family. To the public, she was a name associated with the red light district, a young woman whose life had been derailed by a struggle with heroin. But to those who loved her, she was the girl from Kesgrave who had once worked at an insurance firm, a daughter who had simply lost her way in the shadows of addiction. Her father described her as being caught in a world apart, a secret world that had finally claimed her life. The confirmation of her death turned the simmering anxiety of Ipswich into a cold, hard fear. The realization that Gemma had been in that water for 2 weeks, while the search for her continued elsewhere, was a heavy burden for the community to bear. The forensic challenges presented by Belstead Brook were immense. Water is often the enemy of a criminal investigator, acting as a natural solvent that can wash away the microscopic evidence that modern science relies upon. Because Gemma's body had been immersed in the fast-flowing stream for 14 days, the hope of finding foreign DNA or fibers was significantly diminished. She was found naked, a detail that added both horror and complexity to the case. Without her clothing, the investigators lost the primary surface that might have held the perpetrator's hair or carpet fibers. The pathologists worked in a world of silence, meticulously examining her body for any sign of how she had died. Yet, remarkably, there were no obvious wounds, no signs of a struggle, and no immediate cause of death could be established. It was as if she had simply ceased to be, her life extinguished by a hand that left almost no mark. As the sun set on that grim December day, the investigation was officially named Operation Sumac. The scale of the task began to dawn on the Suffolk Constabulary. They were not just looking for a killer. They were looking for a predator who moved through the night with a terrifying efficiency. And while the discovery of Gemma provided a tragic ending to one search, it only intensified the desperation of another. Tania Nicol, only 19 years old, was still missing. She had disappeared 2 weeks before Gemma, and the fear was now a palpable thing, a weight in the chest of every resident. The brook continued to flow, cold and indifferent, but the secrets it held were starting to surface. The town of Ipswich braced itself, knowing that the waters of Belstead Brook might have more stories to tell before the winter was through. The morning of December 8th, 2006, broke with a leaden sky that seemed to press down upon the Suffolk countryside. The frost clung stubbornly to the reeds lining the banks of the Belstead Brook near Copdock Mill. It was a landscape of muted grays and browns, where the only movement came from the slow, turgid flow of the water. Police divers, encased in thick neoprene against the biting cold, prepared to enter the depths once more. They were searching for anything, a scrap of fabric, a discarded item, some fragment of a life interrupted, that might explain what had happened to Gemma Adams, whose body had been recovered just 6 days earlier. The air was thick with a quiet, desperate hope that was quickly being overshadowed by a growing sense of dread. Every splash into the dark water echoed like a heartbeat in the morning stillness, haunting and heavy with unspoken fears. Beneath the surface, the world was silent and opaque. Visibility was measured in mere inches, a murky green veil hiding the secrets of the brook. The divers moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their gloved hands brushing against the silt and submerged branches of fallen willow trees. It was a painstaking process, a blind man's search through the debris of the winter. Above them, the support teams watched the bubbles rising to the surface, marking the progress of the men below. The silence of the morning was punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic from the nearby roads, a reminder of the world that continued to turn, while this dark corner of Suffolk stood completely still. The water was bone-chillingly cold, a physical weight that seemed to seep into the very soul of the rescue operation, chilling the bones and dampening the spirits of everyone present. Then, at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, the rhythm of the search changed. A diver's hand met something that did not belong to the natural world of the riverbed. There was a signal, a sharp tug on a line, and an immediate shift in the energy of the team on the bank. The water parted as the discovery was carefully brought toward the surface. It was not Gemma's missing belongings they had found. This was another young woman, her life extinguished and cast into the cold embrace of the brook. The realization hit the officers like a physical blow. This was Tania Nicol. She had been missing since the 30th of October, and for 39 long days, her family had lived in the agonizing limbo of the unknown. To find her here, in the same stretch of water, was a revelation that changed everything for the investigation, shattering any hope of a simple case. Tania was only 19 years old, the youngest of those who had vanished into the shadows of the Ipswich red light district. She had left her home on that Monday evening in late October, telling her mother she was heading into town. The truth of her life was a secret she had kept tucked away, a vulnerability born of struggle. Her disappearance had been the first domino to fall, the first sign that something was deeply wrong in the quiet streets. For over a month, her face had looked out from missing persons posters, her vibrant smile a haunting contrast to the grim reality now surfacing from the silt. The discovery near Copdock Mill provided an answer, but it was an answer that brought only a profound and hollow grief to those who waited and prayed for her safe return. The atmosphere within the incident room at the police headquarters shifted instantly. The discovery of Tania Nicol transformed Operation Sumac into a hunt for a serial predator. The detectives looked at the maps pinned to the walls, the pins representing where the women were last seen and where they were found. The patterns began to emerge, chilling and calculated. They were no longer looking for an isolated tragedy. They were hunting someone who moved through the night with a terrifying purpose. The geographical link, the same brook, the same proximity, suggested a killer who was comfortable in these desolate, quiet places. The scale of the tragedy was widening, and the weight of the responsibility felt by every officer grew tenfold. They were facing a monster that the winter fog could no longer hide from the light. As the news filtered out, a palpable fear settled over the streets of Ipswich. The red light district became a ghost town. Women who worked those corners felt the cold breath of a killer on their necks. Every car that slowed, every stranger in the shadows was a threat. The police presence was increased, sirens cutting through the night air, but the comfort was thin. Families locked their doors. The investigation was now a desperate race. Fearing the shadow over the city was only beginning to grow. The air in Suffolk during the month of December carries a peculiar, heavy stillness. It is a cold that does not just nip at the skin, but seems to settle deep within the bones, hushed and persistent. As the calendar turned toward the middle of the month in 2006, the focus of the investigation drifted away from the dark, churning waters of the brooks, and toward the silent, skeletal embrace of the Nacton Woods. These woods, situated just 5 miles or so from the center of Ipswich, are a place where the wind whispers through the pine needles and the damp earth smells of ancient decay and winter rest. On the afternoon of December 10th, the quiet of this woodland was shattered. A passerby, a motorist catching a glimpse of something unusual through the trees near Amberfield School, pulled over, perhaps expecting to find a discarded mannequin or a forgotten piece of art left in the brush. Instead, they found the third piece of a nightmare that was rapidly consuming the peace of the county. The woman lying among the frozen leaves was 24-year-old Annalee Alderton. To the world following the headlines, she was another name in a grim tally, but to those who knew her, she was a mother, a daughter, and a woman of profound complexity. Her mother, Marie, remembered her as a bright, intelligent soul who had once lived a vibrant life in Cyprus. A girl with a swishing blonde ponytail and a quick laugh. But the shadows of addiction had found her early, following the loss of her father when she was only 16. By the time she reached the woods of Nacton, Annalee was living a life that investigators often describe as chaotic, yet she remained a person of immense value to her 5-year-old son, Freddie. The tragedy of her discovery was compounded by a detail that local authorities only shared later with a heavy heart. Annalee was 3 months pregnant when her life was stolen. The silence of the woods seemed to grow even deeper as the forensic teams arrived, their white suits stark against the brown and gray of the winter undergrowth. As the investigators began their painstaking work, a chilling realization took hold. The killer's pattern was shifting, evolving into something even more theatrical and deliberate. The first 2 victims, Gemma and Tania, had been left in the water, their bodies surrendered to the currents of the brooks. But Annalee was left on land, positioned with a macabre sense of purpose that sent shivers through the veteran officers on the scene. She was found naked, her body laid out in a cruciform position, her arms outstretched at right angles as if she were a symbol in a dark ritual. There was no attempt to hide her, no effort to bury her beneath the leaf litter or conceal her within the thickets. She was placed to be found, a vulnerable and silent witness to a killer who was no longer hiding his handiwork in the depths of the river. This shift from water to land suggested an escalation in confidence, a terrifying sense of ownership over the landscape surrounding the town. The lack of clothing at the scene was a haunting detail that unified the cases, yet it presented a massive forensic challenge. In the cold, damp environment of Nacton Woods, the killer had stripped Annalie of everything, leaving nothing behind but her physical presence. No jewelry, no handbag, no scraps of the life she had been living. Detectives wondered if these items were kept as trophies or discarded in some distant, unknown location. The act of stripping the victims was not just a means of removing evidence. It was an act of total stripping of identity, leaving the women exposed to the elements and the gaze of whoever happened upon them. In the quiet of the morgue, the cause of death was confirmed as asphyxiation. There were no signs of a struggle that might have left behind obvious clues, suggesting that the end had come swiftly, perhaps from behind, in a moment of sudden and overwhelming violence that left no room for escape. For the people of Ipswich, the news of a third body in just over a week brought a sense of paralysis. The fear was no longer a background noise. It was the lead story of every conversation. The city felt smaller, the streets more dangerous, and the woods of Nacton, once a place for quiet walks and nature, were now cordoned off behind yellow tape and guarded by officers in high-visibility jackets. The investigation, codenamed Operation Sumac, was growing into one of the largest manhunts in the history of British policing. Hundreds of officers were drafted in, and thousands of hours of footage from closed-circuit television were being scrutinized for a glimpse of a car, a face, or a shadow that did not belong. Annalie had last been seen on December 3rd, boarding a train from Harwich to Manningtree, her image captured on grainy security cameras as she inspected her reflection in a window. It was a mundane moment of life that now felt like a sacred, final memory. Inside the police incident rooms, the pressure was suffocating. 3 women had been found, and the timeline was accelerating with a speed that defied logic. The killer was moving through the red light district like a ghost, selecting his targets and transporting them to these disparate deposition sites without leaving a trace. Every leaf in Nacton Woods was treated as potential evidence. Every footprint in the mud was measured and cast. The scientists worked through the nights, looking for a single hair, a fiber from a carpet, or a microscopic drop of DNA that could bridge the gap between the victims and the predator. The cruciform pose of Annalie Alderton haunted the dreams of those working the case. It spoke of a killer who spent time with the bodies, someone who felt a need to arrange and display his crimes. As the winter sun dipped below the horizon on that 10th day of December, the shadows in the woods lengthened, and the town of Ipswich held its breath, wondering if the nightmare had finally reached its peak, or if there were still more secrets hidden in the cold Suffolk soil. The winter of 2006 did not arrive in Ipswich with the usual festive cheer. Instead, it descended as a thick, suffocating blanket of gray mist and bone-deep cold. The town, once a bustling hub of market-day activity and coastal charm, began to feel like a fortress under internal threat. By the second week of December, the atmosphere had curdled into something unrecognizable. What had started as a series of missing persons reports had transformed into a nightmare that moved with such velocity the local psyche could barely keep pace. The streets, once familiar and safe, were now mapped with invisible zones of danger. Every footfall on the pavement seemed to echo with a new, sharp anxiety. The cobblestones, slick with the persistent East Anglian drizzle, reflected not just the Christmas lights, but the flickering blue of police sirens that had become a permanent fixture of the landscape. Inside the police incident rooms, the tension was a physical presence, but out in the press rooms, the voices of the authorities had taken on a grim quality that the people of Suffolk had never heard. Assistant Chief Constable Jackie Cheer stood before the microphones, her expression etched with the gravity of the moment. Her words were a chilling departure from standard police protocol. She did not just offer safety tips. She issued a stark, desperate plea. To the 30 or 40 women who made their living on the streets of the red light district, her message was harrowing in its simplicity. She told them to stay off the streets. She warned that if they were out alone at night, they were putting themselves in grave, perhaps fatal, danger. It was a moment where the law stepped aside for the sake of survival, promising an amnesty for those who came forward with information, setting aside the usual boundaries to focus on the singular, terrifying goal of preserving life. This was a community under siege, but the enemy was invisible. He was a presence that felt omnipresent in the dark corners of London Road and the industrial shadows near the football ground. For the women working in these areas, the choice was an impossible one. The festive season was approaching, a time of intense financial pressure, yet the very act of working meant stepping directly into the crosshairs of a predator. The police, recognizing this desperate economic reality, took the unprecedented step of coordinating with local charities to provide cash handouts to the women. It was a surreal sight in a modern British town, vulnerable women being paid to stay indoors and hide, because the alternative was too gruesome to contemplate. Yet, even with this support, the fear was a cold companion that no amount of money could warm as the nights grew longer, and the death toll continued to rise. The impact of this terror rippled far beyond the red light district. The entire female population of Ipswich was living under a shadow of caution that felt like a regression to a darker, more restrictive era. The advice from Detective Chief Superintendent Stuart Gull was clear and pervasive. Do not go out alone. Stick together. Look after your friends. For university students, office workers, and mothers, the simple act of walking to a car or waiting for a bus became a calculated risk. The local newspapers were filled with the faces of the missing and the dead, their eyes staring out from the newsstands, a constant reminder of the vulnerability that now defined the town. People began to look at their neighbors differently. They scrutinized the drivers of every passing car. The so-called Suffolk Strangler was not a ghost. He was a person who likely lived among them, breathing the same damp air and walking these same streets. Nightfall brought a peculiar, heavy silence to the residential neighborhoods. The usual sounds of the evening, the distant murmur of the pub or the occasional shout of a passerby, were replaced by a watchful, brittle quiet. High above, the rhythmic thrum of the police helicopter, a yellow and blue sentinel, became the heartbeat of the city. Its searchlight would occasionally sweep across the woodland at Nacton or the dark waters of the rivers, a beam of artificial sun searching for secrets in the dead of night. In the industrial estates, the orange glow of the street lamps seemed to fail, unable to pierce the gloom where the shadows felt thicker than they should. Every car that slowed down, every door that opened, was treated as a potential threat. The community was united in its terror, yet isolated by its growing suspicion of the unknown person watching from the dark. As December progressed, the investigation, codenamed Operation Sumac, grew into one of the largest and most complex in British criminal history. Thousands of calls flooded the incident rooms at Martlesham. More than 500 officers from 40 different police forces were drafted in to assist, their fluorescent jackets a constant reminder that the town was no longer its own. They stood at cordons, they searched the riverbanks in heavy wetsuits, and they moved through the thick undergrowth of the countryside with painstaking slowness. The pressure on these officers was immense, the weight of 5 lives lost, and the fear of a 6th hanging over every morning briefing. The town held its breath, waiting for a breakthrough, waiting for the moment when the siege would finally end, and the night would belong to them once again. But for now, the darkness remained deep, and the predator remained at large, hidden in plain sight, perhaps watching the very people who were hunting him. The calendar turned to December 12th, 2006. The air over Suffolk was a heavy, biting shroud, thick with a dampness that seemed to seep into the very marrow of the town's bones. By now, the fear in Ipswich was no longer a quiet hum. It was a deafening roar of silence. Paula Clennell, 24 years old, had vanished into the cold only 2 days prior. There was a haunting piece of television footage that would soon become etched into the national memory. A brief, grainy interview where Paula, wrapped in a winter coat, spoke about her own fears of the killer roaming the streets. Her voice was steady, yet her eyes betrayed a flickering uncertainty. She had told the reporter that she was wary, that she was trying to be careful, yet the necessity of her life drove her back into the shadows of the red light district. Now, as the sun struggled to rise through the mist, her voice was all that remained of her presence in the town. On that Tuesday morning, a police helicopter hummed low over the village of Levington, its blades rhythmically slicing through the frigid air. The landscape below was a monochrome tapestry of bare trees and frost-covered fields. It was here, near the bustling artery of the A14 road, that a search team discovered a body. The scene was cordoned off with the familiar, jarring yellow tape that had become a recurring scar across the Suffolk countryside. The woman was identified as Paula Clennell. She was found in a patch of woodland, her body a stark, tragic contrast to the dormant winter earth. The investigators moved with a hushed reverence, their breath blossoming in white clouds as they began the painstaking process of documenting the site. Every fallen leaf and every disturbed twig was treated as a potential witness to the violence that had unfolded under the cover of the long, dark nights. But the shadows had not yet yielded all their secrets. As the forensic teams worked on the site where Paula lay, another discovery was made only hundreds of yards away. A second body was located, partially concealed by the undulating terrain and winter scrub. This was Annette Nichols, 29 years old. Annette had been missing for longer, her last confirmed sighting having been in early December. She was a mother, a woman whose life had been a complex journey of struggles and hopes, now ended in the silence of the Levington woods. The positioning of her body mirrored the grim patterns established by the previous victims. She was found nude, her clothing missing, left in the open air. The realization hit the investigation team with the force of a physical blow. 2 women found on the same day, in the same stretch of woods. The predator was operating with a terrifying speed. The tally had reached a staggering 5. 5 women, all lost in the span of just over 6 weeks. Gemma Adams, Tania Nichol, Annalie Alderton, Paula Clennell, and Annette Nichols. The names were recited like a tragic litany across the evening news. The sheer velocity of the killings was unprecedented in modern British history. It was as if a predatory ghost was haunting the edges of the town, moving with an efficiency that left the police and the public reeling. The town of Ipswich felt smaller and tighter, as if the walls were closing in. The streets of the red light district, usually flickering with the uneasy energy of the night trade, were now desolate, abandoned to the wind and the watchful eyes of undercover officers. The predator was no longer just a threat. He was a presence that occupied every conversation and every dark corner of the Suffolk landscape. The forensic challenges at the Levington site were monumental. Because Paula and Annette were found so close together, the area became a massive outdoor laboratory. Technicians in white protective suits moved like ghosts through the trees, their flashlights cutting through the gathering dusk. They searched for microscopic traces, a fiber, a hair, or a droplet of something that did not belong in the natural world. The ground was frozen hard, which helped preserve some impressions, but made the delicate work of recovery even more difficult. Every inch of the soil was sifted with care. The proximity of the bodies suggested a killer who was becoming either more confident or more desperate, returning to the same rural graveyard to dispose of his burdens. The heavy scent of damp earth and rotting vegetation hung in the air, a sensory reminder of the transition from life to the cold embrace of the ground. As the news of the 5th discovery broke, a profound sense of mourning settled over the region. The families of the 5 women were thrust into a shared nightmare, united by a grief that was being played out on a national stage. Operation Sumac was now a sprawling leviathan of an investigation, with hundreds of officers drafted in from across the country. They pored over thousands of hours of closed-circuit television footage, hoping to find a recurring vehicle or a face that did not fit the scenery. The pressure was suffocating. Every hour that passed without a suspect felt like an invitation for the shadow to strike again. The 5 women were no longer just names on a missing persons flyer. They were the heart of a tragedy that had transformed a quiet market town into the epicenter of a hunt for a monster. The night remained cold as the hunt intensified under the flickering streetlights. Inside the investigation center, the atmosphere was thick with a quiet intensity. It was the winter of 2006, and the weight of the 5 lives lost hung over every officer like a heavy shroud. They retreated from the biting winds of the Suffolk countryside into the artificial glow of the major investigation room. Here, the primary weapon was not a magnifying glass, but time. Thousands upon thousands of hours of closed-circuit television footage had been gathered from every corner of Ipswich. Every petrol station, every shop, and every traffic junction had yielded its memory. The task was monumental. Officers sat in rows, their eyes straining against the flicker of monitors, searching for a ghost. They were looking for a needle in a graveyard of pixels, hoping for a thread that would lead them directly to the truth. The footage was often difficult to watch. In the mid-2000s, the quality of security cameras was frequently grainy. The world on screen was a jittery, monochrome version of reality, where shadows stretched and faces blurred into smudges. Yet the detectives persisted. They focused their attention on the red light district, specifically the areas around London Road and Handford Road, where the victims had last been seen alive. It was a repetitive, soul-crushing process. They watched the same stretches of pavement for hours, noting every pedestrian and every passing vehicle. They were looking for a pattern, a recurring visitor who did not belong or who appeared too frequently in the dead of night. The low hum of the hard drives and the soft clicking of mice were the only sounds as they searched. Slowly, through the digital fog, a shape began to manifest with chilling regularity. It was a car, a dark 4-door sedan that seemed to haunt the narrow streets of the red light district during the small hours of the morning. As the investigators cross-referenced the times of the disappearances with the movements of traffic, the vehicle stood out. It was a Ford Mondeo. In the dim light of the street lamps, its color was difficult to pin down, appearing sometimes black and sometimes a deep midnight blue. The car moved with a slow, predatory rhythm, circling the blocks where the women had stood under the orange glow of the sodium lights. It was not a taxi, nor was it a vehicle belonging to a resident. It was a silent observer, a metallic shadow appearing in the background. The detectives began to map the movements of this blue Mondeo with surgical precision. They used automatic number plate recognition technology to track its journey across the city. The data revealed a disturbing consistency. This car was not just passing through, it was cruising. On the nights when the women vanished, the Mondeo was there, its headlights cutting through the Suffolk mist. It was seen on London Road, then minutes later on a different street, weaving a complex web through the neighborhood. The investigators felt a surge of adrenaline as they realized they had found their primary lead. They began to zoom in on every frame, trying to catch a glimpse of the driver's face through the reflection of the glass. The driver remained a silhouette, but the car was becoming a character in this grim narrative. Every detail of the car was scrutinized. They looked at the way the light hit the trim, the specific model of the alloy wheels, and the faded paint on the rear bumper. They were searching for any distinguishing mark that would separate this Ford Mondeo from the thousands of others on the road. The breakthrough came when they managed to isolate a clear image of the registration plate from a camera near a petrol station. The characters were small and blurred, but with digital enhancement, the sequence began to emerge. It was a local registration, one that allowed the police to dive into the vast databases of the driver and vehicle licensing agency. The tension was palpable as the search narrowed from a type of car to a specific owner, pointing toward a name. The registration led them directly to a house on London Road, a large Edwardian building that had been converted into flats. The owner of the blue Ford Mondeo was a man named Steve Wright. He was a 48-year-old former forklift driver who had moved to the area recently. As the detectives looked at his history, the pieces of the puzzle began to click into place. Wright had been working night shifts, which gave him the cover for his nocturnal wanderings. He was a man who lived in the shadows of the very streets where the victims had sought a living. The blue car, once just a grainy image on a screen, was now a direct link to a suspect. The hunt was no longer for a ghost, but for a man who had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for the cold night to fall upon the streets. The air within the forensic laboratory in Huntingdon was a sharp, biting contrast to the damp and heavy mist that had settled over the Orwell Bridge during those dark weeks of 2006. Inside, the world was reduced to white surfaces, bright fluorescent lights, and the soft, rhythmic hum of refrigeration units that held the silent stories of the departed. For the scientists working within these walls, the investigation was no longer about the sprawling geography of the Suffolk countryside or the frantic activity of the police stations. It had become a journey into the invisible. They were peering into a microscopic landscape, searching for a ghost, a single thread of biological information that could bridge the gap between a faceless killer and the 5 women who had been taken from the streets of Ipswich. The pressure was immense, a weight that seemed to sit on the shoulders of every technician in a white coat. They knew that the answer lay somewhere in the hundreds of swabs and samples that had been meticulously collected from the scenes in the woods and the brooks. Behind reinforced glass, the scientists moved with a slow and deliberate grace, handling evidence with the reverence it deserved. They focused their efforts on the samples recovered from Annalie Alderton, Paula Clennell, and Annette Nichols. These 3 women had been left in the open, exposed to the elements, yet they carried within them a secret. Using techniques that felt like something out of a futuristic novel, the team worked to isolate what they called a male profile. It was a painstaking process of extraction and amplification, where tiny fragments of genetic material were coaxed into a recognizable pattern. They were looking for the DNA of a stranger, someone who had no business being part of their final moments. Each technician understood that a single mistake or a moment of contamination could shatter the entire investigation. They worked through the nights, their eyes tired but their focus unwavering, driven by the knowledge that a predator was still out there, moving through the shadows of the red light district while the town held its collective breath. The breakthrough did not arrive with the sound of a siren or the shouting of an order. It came in the form of a soft, digital glow on a computer screen. The forensic team had successfully isolated a clear and distinct male profile from the evidence. This genetic signature was then fed into the vast digital architecture of the National DNA database, a library of the country's known offenders. For a few heart-stopping moments, the system whirred, cross-referencing the code against millions of others. And then the screen flickered. A match. The silence of the laboratory was broken by the quiet realization that they were no longer looking for a phantom. The system had produced a name. It was a cold hit, a direct link between the biological evidence found on the victims and a man whose details had been logged years prior. This was the moment the tide turned, the moment the scattered pieces of the puzzle began to rush together with a terrifying velocity. The digital thread had finally found its anchor. The name that stared back at the investigators from the screen was Stephen Gerald James Wright. He was not a known violent criminal or a man with a long history of dark deeds. Instead, the reason his DNA was in the system at all was almost mundane, a stroke of investigative luck that would later be described as his ultimate downfall. 5 years earlier, in 2001, he had been working as a barman at a hotel in Felixstowe. During his time there, He had been caught stealing 80 pounds from the till to cover his personal debts. It was a minor theft, a petty crime that resulted in a small fine and a standard procedure, the taking of a D and a swab. At the time, it probably felt like a shameful but insignificant moment in his life. He could never have imagined that those few drops of genetic material, stored in a sterile tube and digitized into a national database, would one day act as a silent witness to a campaign of murder. The man who had stolen 80 pounds was now the primary suspect in the most significant serial killer investigation in modern British history. As the police received the notification from the laboratory, the pieces of the puzzle began to lock into place with a chilling precision. They cross-referenced the name Steve Wright with the registration data they had been gathering from the automatic number plate recognition cameras. Suddenly, the blue Ford Mondeo that had been seen circling the red light district was no longer just a suspicious vehicle. It was a weapon. The address associated with the name was 49 London Road. This was the large, imposing Edwardian building they had already been watching, the house that sat squarely in the heart of the area where the women had worked. The man lived exactly where the victims disappeared. The scientists in the lab had provided the bridge, and the detectives on the ground now had a target. The quiet forklift driver, a man described by some as unremarkable and even polite, was now the center of a storm. The forensic evidence was the common denominator, a microscopic brand that linked him to the bodies found in the woods. But the DNA was only the beginning of the scientific onslaught. The forensic teams were also uncovering a forest of microscopic fibers. They found tiny black nylon strands in the hair of Tania Nicol, fibers that were eventually traced back to the footwell of Wright's car. They found specks of blood on a reflective jacket inside his home, blood that belonged to Paula Clennell and Annette Nichols. Every item in his life, from the carpet in his flat to the seats of his car, was becoming a witness against him. The investigators realized that even though the bodies had been left in water or exposed to the harsh winter rain for days, the science was resilient. It was as if the victims were reaching out from the cold ground, pointing their fingers directly at the resident of London Road. The net was closing, the slow and steady work of the laboratory providing the strength for the final strike. The man who thought he had washed away his crimes was about to find that the smallest, most invisible details of his life had become his judge and jury. The microscopic threads and the invisible maps of DNA always point toward a center. In the case of the Suffolk killings, that center was not a monster from a nightmare, but a man who appeared entirely unremarkable. To understand how a predator could vanish so easily into the backdrop of a working-class town, we must look at the life of the man who occupied the house at 79 London Road. His name was Steve Wright, and to the world, he was simply a forklift driver, a former barman, and a neighbor who kept his lawn tidy. But the history of Steve Wright is a slow accumulation of shadows, a life spent on the fringes of society where the lines between service and exploitation often blurred into gray. He was a man defined by what he was not, a silent figure shifting through the damp streets of Ipswich. Long before he became the figure of dread in the local newspapers, Wright sought the anonymity of the ocean. Born in 1958 in the village of Erpingham, his childhood was defined by the transient nature of a military family, moving from base to base, from Malta to Singapore. By the time he was 16, he had left school with no qualifications, finding work as a chef on the ferries that sailed from Felixstowe. But it was in the early 1980s that his horizon truly expanded. He became a steward on the Queen Elizabeth II, the legendary ocean liner. Imagine the contrast. The gilded luxury of the upper decks, the champagne and the evening gowns, while Wright moved through the narrow corridors below, a servant to the elite. During his time at sea, the ship docked in ports far from English law, including the neon-drenched districts of Thailand. It was here, investigators believe, that his appetite for the sex trade was first codified, away from the watchful eyes of anyone who knew him. By the autumn of 2006, Wright had settled into a rhythm that seemed stable. He was living with his partner, Pamela, in a small, end-terrace house at 79 London Road. The timing of their move was chillingly precise. They had unpacked their boxes just as the first disappearances began to haunt the district. London Road was the beating heart of the town's red light area, a place where the streetlights hummed with a yellow, tired energy. The house itself was a two-bedroom structure, 1,060 square feet of cramped space. It was a house that looked like any other on the block, yet its position was strategic. From his front door, Wright could see the very corners where the women he would eventually target stood in the cold. He lived in the middle of their world, a silent observer who knew their names and their habits, watching them from the shadows of his own porch while the rest of the neighborhood slept. The true darkness of 79 London Road emerged when the sun went down and the domesticity of the day faded. Pamela worked the night shift at a local call center. Leaving the house around the time, the streets began to fill with the evening's trade. This was the moment the forklift driver transformed. As soon as his partner's car pulled away, the house became a staging ground for a double life. Wright was so concerned with maintaining the illusion of normalcy that he would not use the bed when he brought women back. Instead, he laid out two of his jackets on the bedroom floor, a makeshift pallet intended to prevent any lingering sense from alerting Pamela when she returned in the dawn light. He moved through the house with predatory caution, listening for the sound of a key in the lock, while the engine of his blue Ford Mondeo cooled in the driveway. The mundane sounds of a suburban home became the backdrop for his horrific secrets. He was a man of quiet desperation, hidden behind a mountain of gambling debts and a history of failed ventures. He had managed pubs and driven lorries, and had twice attempted to end his own life when the weight of his failures became too heavy. In 1994, he had sat in his car, waiting for the carbon monoxide to take hold, and in the year 2000, he had swallowed a handful of pills. But life continued to pull him back. In 2001, he was caught stealing 80 pounds from a pub till to pay off his debts, a small crime that would later prove to be his ultimate undoing. This petty theft led to the collection of his DNA, a digital ghost that sat waiting in a database. He was a man who felt the world was closing in on him, a man who sought control in the only way he knew how, by preying on those even more vulnerable than himself. He was the man on London Road. The darkness of a December morning in East Anglia is a heavy, saturating thing. On the 19th of December, 2006, the air in Ipswich was brittle with frost, the kind of cold that clings to the lungs and makes the silence of the streets feel even deeper. For weeks, the town had been held in a grip of collective terror, a winter of shadows where 5 women had vanished and were later found in the unforgiving landscape of the Suffolk countryside. But while the town slept, the gears of a massive police operation were turning with a silent, clinical precision. This was the culmination of Operation Sumac, a moment where the vast ocean of data, DNA profiles, and witness statements finally narrowed down to a single point on a map. That point was number 79 London Road. It was an Edwardian conversion, a house of red brick and sturdy window frames that sat on one of the main arteries leading toward the red light district. At exactly 5 o'clock in the morning, the silence of London Road was punctured not by sirens, but by the coordinated arrival of tactical teams. There was no theatrical display, no flashing lights to alert the neighborhood. Instead, there was the rhythmic, purposeful footfall of officers moving in the gloom. The target was a 48-year-old forklift driver who had recently moved into the flat with his partner. To the neighbors, he was a quiet, almost invisible figure. To the police, he was the primary suspect in a campaign of murder that had shocked the entire nation. Inside the flat, the world was still. Steve Wright was reportedly already awake, beginning his morning ritual as he prepared for a shift at the docks. He was a man of routine, a man who functioned in the early hours of the day. When the knock came, the firm, authoritative signal of the law, the transition from mundane reality to the interior of a police van was swift. There was no reported struggle, no dramatic outcry. Wright was taken into custody on suspicion of all 5 murders, leaving behind a home that would soon become one of the most intensely studied forensic sites in British history. As he was driven away, the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, revealing the white forensic tent that was already being erected on the front lawn. By mid-morning, the scene at London Road had transformed into a sterile hive of activity. Officers dressed in head-to-toe white forensic suits moved in and out of the property, their presence a stark contrast to the everyday bustle of the waking street. They were looking for the microscopic, the invisible, and the overlooked. Every inch of the 2-bedroom flat was subjected to the gaze of the scene of crime officers. They were searching for more than just physical weapons. They were searching for the web of evidence that links a killer to his victims. They collected clothing, including a pair of Tesco brand tracksuit bottoms and a yellow fluorescent jacket, items that would later prove to be of monumental significance. The air inside the house was cold. The heat likely turned off as the forensic teams began their slow, methodical harvest of the truth. Outside, parked on the road, was a blue Ford Mondeo ZX. To any passerby, it was a common vehicle, the quintessential car of the working man. But to the investigators, this car was a vessel of secrets. Witnesses had previously described a dark car circling the red light district at odd hours, and the police had been tracking its movements through automatic number plate recognition cameras. At approximately 9 o'clock that morning, the Mondeo was hoisted onto a flatbed lorry to be taken to a secure facility for a full forensic sweep. It was a mobile crime scene. The prosecution would later allege that Wright was fastidious about this car, cleaning it at strange times, often in the dead of night, paying particular attention to the wheel arches. But no amount of scrubbing could erase what the microscopes would find. The forensic results would eventually paint a devastating picture. Inside the Mondeo, hidden in the fibers of the passenger footwell carpet, was a single 5mm strand of black nylon. It was a coarse, durable fiber that matched the carpet perfectly, and yet it had been found tangled in the hair of 19-year-old Tania Nicol. On the back seats and the parcel shelf, experts found tiny flecks of blood that yielded a partial DNA match for Paula Clennell. Red acrylic fibers, possibly from a travel rug or a sofa, were found on the bodies of multiple victims and within the car itself. These tiny, colored threads acted like a map, tracing the movement of the women from the streets of Ipswich into the confines of that blue car, and finally to the quiet, dark places where they were left. The weight of the evidence found on that single morning was staggering. As the forensic teams worked through the day and into the night, the case shifted from a desperate search for a phantom to a methodical assembly of facts. The tracksuit bottoms Wright had been wearing at the moment of his arrest were found to carry the same microscopic blue and yellow fibers discovered on the skin of Annalee Alderton. It was as if every garment he owned, every surface he touched, had kept a silent record of his movements. The quiet man from number 79 was now at the center of a storm of forensic data, a storm that would eventually lead him from the cold streets of Ipswich to the sterile silence of a courtroom. The dawn arrest had been the end of a nightmare for the town, but for the investigators, the real work of proving the impossible had only just begun. The air outside the Ipswich Crown Court in January of 2008 was a biting, hollow cold, the kind that settles deep into your bones and refuses to leave. Inside the courtroom, however, the atmosphere was heavy with a different kind of chill, a stillness born of anticipation and the gravity of 5 lives lost. We have followed this path through the dark woods and the quiet streams of Suffolk, And now we arrive at the place where the silence of the night meets the cold light of justice. The gallery was packed with families, journalists, and a community that had held its breath for over a year. You can almost hear the soft, rhythmic rustle of heavy legal robes and the muffled coughs of a crowd waiting for the final chapter of a nightmare to be written in ink and testimony. The room smelled of old wood and damp wool, a sanctuary of order against the chaos of the preceding months. As the trial commenced, the prosecution began to weave a tapestry of evidence so intricate it felt like a microscopic net. They spoke of fibers, tiny invisible threads that told a story of proximity and violence. There were specialized blue acrylic fibers from a forklift truck, matching those found on the clothing of the women, and black carpet fibers from a dark blue Ford Mondeo that had carried secrets through the narrow streets. The jury listened as experts described a single yellow reflective jacket found in a small apartment on London Road. On that jacket were microscopic traces of blood, a crimson signature that linked the defendant to the very women he claimed to have only known in passing. The DNA evidence was presented with a clinical, undeniable weight. 1 in a billion, the experts said, the odds of the genetic profiles belonging to anyone else. It was a mountain of truth built from the smallest, most hidden fragments of the physical world, proving that even in the dark, we leave a part of ourselves behind. Steve Wright sat in the dock, a man of 49 years with a face that revealed nothing. He was a forklift driver, a former steward, a man who had moved through the world almost unnoticed until the shadow of the Suffolk Strangler fell across the region. Throughout the 6 weeks of the trial, he remained stony-faced, his eyes fixed forward, avoiding the weeping gazes of the families in the gallery. His defense was one of extraordinary coincidence, a claim that his presence in the lives of these 5 women was merely a series of unfortunate overlaps. But the prosecution painted a different picture, a portrait of a man who moved with premeditation and a dark, focused intent. They spoke of a hunting ground and a campaign of murder that targeted the most vulnerable members of society. The jurors, 7 men and 5 women, watched him closely, searching for a flicker of remorse or a sign of humanity, but found only the quiet, steady breath of a man who seemed detached from the tragedy he had authored. On the 21st of February, after 8 hours of deliberation that felt like an eternity to those waiting in the halls, the jury returned. The silence was absolute as the foreman stood. 5 times, the word guilty was spoken. It echoed against the high ceilings and the oak-paneled walls, a rhythmic drumbeat of accountability. Guilty for the death of Tania Nichol, who was only 19. Guilty for Gemma Adams, who was 25. Guilty for Annalie Alderton, who was 24. Guilty for Paula Clennell, who was also 24, and guilty for Annette Nichols, who was 29. In that moment, the weight that had pressed down on the town of Ipswich began to lift, replaced by a somber, hollow relief. The defendant showed no emotion, staring straight ahead as his fate was sealed. The families held one another, their tears a mixture of fresh grief and the quiet peace of knowing that the man who had stolen their daughters would never walk the streets of Suffolk again. The following morning, at 10:30, the sentencing was handed down. Mr. Justice Gross did not mince his words, describing the crimes as a targeted campaign of murder. He spoke of the vulnerability of the women, noting that while they struggled with addiction and the hardships of their lives, it was not their choices that killed them, but the hands of the man standing before the court. The sentence was a whole life order, a rare and severe decree in the English legal system. It meant that life would truly mean life, and Steve Wright would never be eligible for parole. He would live out his days within the gray walls of a prison cell, far from the red light district and the quiet country lanes where he had discarded his victims. The judge's voice was steady and calm, providing a finality that the community had craved for so long. The darkness was finally contained, locked away where it could no longer reach for the light of innocent lives. Now, as we look back on the echoes of 2006 and the trial that followed, we choose to remember the women not by the tragedy of their end, but by the lives they lived. Tania, Gemma, Annalie, Paula, and Annette were daughters, sisters, and friends. They were women who dreamed and laughed, who were loved and are still missed. The town of Ipswich has changed. The streets are quieter now, and the shadows have retreated. We let the details of the evidence and the coldness of the courtroom fade into the past, leaving only the lessons of compassion and the memory of 5 souls who deserved a better world. The investigation is over, and the lights in the windows of the town remain bright, a testament to resilience and the enduring power of the truth. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.